Welcome to the Michael Ouzas podcast. I think we're ready to get started. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Today's webinar, real estate for hockey players. So on the agenda today, we just have an introduction in the market, 3 concepts for hockey players. We'll talk about the processes in steps, and we'll talk Q&A. Michael Ouzas, I am a realtor here in the Greater Toronto area. I'm actually licensed for all of Ontario, played professional hockey for 13 years. So before getting into real estate, I was a professional hockey player, played in minors in North America, and then 10 seasons over in Europe. During my time playing, I purchased multiple properties along the way, and that kind of gave me the bug of real estate and eventually becoming a realtor after hockey, of course. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this webinar was because when I was playing, I was lucky. My dad's also a realtor, and he kind of gave me that, hey, Mike, it's time to maybe purchase a property instead of renting every summer. And that's kind of how this started, along with talking with different teammates and different friends who were also in hockey doing similar things. And the other thing I'll mention, if you are looking outside of the Greater Toronto area, I do have an extensive network all over Canada and USA. And this is definitely something where it's educational. I just want to give everyone the tools. And if you have any questions, for sure, reach out. And if you need to get connected with someone in the market that you're looking to purchase in, more than happy to help anyone navigate for sure. So definitely don't be afraid to reach out if that's the case. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get right into the presentation here. So every concept we're going to talk about today is player dependent. And I can't stress that enough. Every player's situation is unique, and there are different rules for each province, each state, each country, different rules in mortgages, rent restrictions, different things like closings, foreign buyer rules. There's also some work involved in real estate, especially if you're going to be purchasing, and if you're purchasing while playing. Typically, there is an element of keeping it as a rental, and then, it is a business. So there is some work involved. It's not super passive, but just something I want to make sure we point out. There is a little bit of fine print. This is for educational purposes only, not intended to be financial advice or to solicit or breach any contracts with other realtors or agents. So let's talk about the hockey player life. And if you're a hockey player, which is probably the reason you're on this call, you know this all too well. We basically have 2 modes. We have an off season and in season. So off season, for most people, at least that I talk to, it's always where to live. Parents, friends, you find a rental, then you need to find a place to train, skate. You want to balance your life, family, friends. You might be working on a new contract, or you might have a current contract. Then you're going to prepare for camp, pack your entire life, and drive back for in season. And this is a very typical off season for most hockey players. And then we move to in season. So then you're going to move to your city, unpack your entire life, training camp, make the team, or if you get reassigned to a new team, find your place to live, build a routine, regular season, playoffs, negotiate a new contract, pack up your entire life again, drive back for off season. And it just repeats itself for the course of what we call a career, of course. So this is the typical hockey player life cycle, and we'll tie this into our concepts for the day as well. So as we talk about real estate, we're going to talk about it in a couple different ways, but the first place we're going to start is in the market and what's happening in the market. And what I really want to wrap our heads around for hockey players is that real estate is long-term thinking. If you're planning on having a 10-year career, you can also think of it as 10 years of owning real estate or 10 years in real estate. Over the course of time, I typed in Canada housing market, and I went back over 10 years. In 2012, they were saying, be very afraid of the Canadian housing bubble. In 2013, Canadian real estate most overvalued in the world. 2015, Canada housing market faces a looming demographic bubble. Then in 2022, level burst risk. In 2020, Swiss Bank says Toronto has 3rd biggest housing bubble in the world. 2023 in April, is this the end of the housing correction? This is media that has been going on as long as I can remember. And I do find that the media tends to take 2 different sides for real estate. It's either everything is crazy hot or everything is going to crash. And they never really just have a real estate is trending normally. Their job is to sell newspapers, of course, but regardless, the media does make things on both sides. So if prices are going up, that could be scary as well. If you're, trying to get into the market, if prices are maybe on the way down, or if properties are facing a quote unquote bubble, that could also be something that's scary too. So that's the media's take on everything. I tend to take a long-term thinking when it comes to real estate. And this is for the Greater Toronto Area, and I will speak to Toronto because that is the market that I live and work in. And the Greater Toronto Area is not just Toronto proper. There are some surrounding cities around. If you're tuning into this from outside of the Greater Toronto Area, this will be the only piece that I just kind of show an example of the market. Otherwise, the rest is very generic and can apply for all markets. But this is 10 years in real estate. And if you look back at May 2013, price for this is just a benchmark average price of all property types combined, was just under 500,000 on average. As we fast forward through 2017, things really propped up. They actually almost doubled in that time. And then there was a drop, some changes in the lending policies and something called a stress test, which we'll not get into today, but things chilled out actually all the way through January 2020. And then things just kind of took off like a rocket. It's kind of surprising for a lot of people, I think, myself included, that prices did. One thing's for sure in Toronto real estate is that we typically follow a trend line all the way across, even with the ebbs and flows of the market. If you look at a 10-year hockey career and you think of now we're in 2023, where are prices going to be in 2033? And it's kind of a weird thing to think, but that's 10 years. That could be 10 years of real estate. And on average, in the Greater Toronto Area, I don't know the other markets specifically, prices have increased 6.7% year over year for the last 40 years on average, which equals approximately like the 7-10 rule where they've doubled every 10 years. Now, that being said, I tend to take a bit of a more conservative approach, let's say 3 to 5% a year appreciation. The biggest thing to think about is if you're planning to have, a 10-year career in pro hockey, more likely than not, the prices in 10 years will probably be higher than what they are today. And that's the whole point of this webinar. Now, let's flip it over to the rent side, because there is a rental component into a lot of the things that I'll be talking about today. Rents have also increased as price of properties have increased, because as it costs more money to float these properties, typically those costs do tend to get passed down to tenants over time. During 2020 and into 2021, especially in the city of Toronto, this is Canada average rents, but in the city of Toronto did the same thing as this. Prices really went down during that time. A lot of people left the city, but now they're actually back up and they're back higher than they ever have been. So if we look at the rental market, May 2023 rental report from rentals.ca, they actually don't pull from MLS, but they pull their own data. And the rental market is extremely competitive, and it still is. The city of Toronto, and you can look at all these different areas. And again, if there are other areas outside of Toronto that you're looking, I'm happy to connect you with an expert in that area to give you more specific numbers to that. But in Toronto, a studio right now, so no bedroom, costs about $2,000 a month. One bedroom is about $2,550 a month, and a two bedroom is about $3,300 a month. Three bedrooms, we don't see them very often, especially for like condos, but for houses, you're talking probably $3,700 to $4,000 a month plus. And similar numbers, Vancouver and different areas. Even cities like Hamilton, Ottawa are creeping up in that $1,600 for a studio, $2,000 for a one bedroom, $2,400 for a two bedroom. The other thing to point out here is that fully furnished rentals are extremely difficult to find, and there is a premium on pricing. So it could be an extra $200 to $300 each month for a fully furnished rental. And if you're doing short term, there might even be another premium on that where you can do an all-inclusive and add a little bit of that to the rent as well. And in a place like Toronto, we do have rental limits when it comes to Airbnbs and things like that, which definitely play another factor, but we won't get too much into that today at all. Let's talk about these three concepts, and this is why we're here today. So the three concepts I wanted to discuss today are purchasing where you want to live in the off-season, purchasing where you are playing in season, and purchasing in a city that you don't live in. You don't live there in the off season. You don't live there while playing. I do have a bonus fourth as well, which we'll get into, and that's for pre-construction. But these are the three concepts for hockey players that could be useful while playing over the course of your career. Now, all three concepts have common traits, and there's a lot of words here, but I'll go through each one by one. The first one, number one, that's super important for all three is location, location, location. I'm sure if you've ever heard about real estate, that is something that comes up every single time. Location is so important. And the reason being is that it makes properties typically more rentable. You're also going to want something livable and something sellable. And typically when you buy a great property in a great location, it's rentable, it's livable, and it's sellable if you ever wanted to sell it in the future, any given time. Each trait or each concept concept is case by case and player dependent, as already mentioned. And it's also important to note that one of these properties might not be your forever home or your future forever home. It might just be a property that is a springboard to the next one over time. You also might want to have a property manager or somebody local who can help you manage taking care of these properties while you're away. You're going to want to time the purchase to work with your season. So whether you're purchasing in season or during the off season, you're going to want to time that purchase to work with the timeline that you're thinking of. There are different short-term rental rules in condo buildings and cities. Foreign buyer rules as well here in Canada just came in January 1st, something to consider, and there could be purchasing rules with that. Typically, for most properties, a lot of the heavy lifting is done in year one. So when you first get that property, if you have to furnish it, if you have to set it up, stage it, or whatever it may be, typically that's done in year one. Again, there is work involved. This is a business as well at the end of the day. So just keep these concepts in mind and these traits in mind for each concept. So let's dive into purchasing where you want to live in the off season. When you purchase where you want to live in the off season, these are some of the keys, and then we'll go through some of the things to consider as well. Purchasing in the off season is typically less contract dependent. Let's say, for example, you're from Toronto, but you go and play in Europe, for example, or you're playing in the USA. It doesn't really matter where your contract is, because every off season, you're probably typically going to come back to, let's say, Toronto. And you probably typically know that city or area well, especially if it's somewhere where you do want to live. This gives you a place to move into every off season. So a little bit easier not having to find somewhere to live or find a quick 3-month short-term rental, which is always tough to do. It is built-in storage for your furniture, which is always kind of nice, where once you furnish a property one time, in the future, you can rent it furnished. So then you don't have to move it out every single time. Move in and drop your suitcases and you're good to go for the summer. You can rent these properties at a premium. And I typically recommend, if you are purchasing something in the off season, you can rent it out medium term. So like 6 to 8 months, fully furnished and all inclusive. And the medium term is nice because typically, if, for example, you're purchasing a condo, the condo rules in most buildings are, I mean, every building's dependent on their own rules, but I would say for most buildings, they typically want a 6-month minimum term. So a medium term would cover that. And then it'll be okay from a season perspective, where if you rent it out for 6 to 8 months, that should line up pretty well with your season. If where you eventually want to live after hockey is where you live in the off season, you already have at least one place that you've purchased during the course of your career. The other nice thing about a medium-term rental, raise the rent to market value each season. So if the rent increases year over year, then you'll start the new market value at the start of the next season. Now, there are a few things to consider with all these properties, but there are other few things to consider. And the first one is that you will be managing from a distance during the season. So if you don't want to deal with any phone calls while you're playing, you can hire a property manager. They do come at a cost, of course, but if you had to get a plumber to the property, you could just make a phone call. The tenant could let them in and hopefully deal with it from a distance. Things have definitely changed in that regard over time, but I do think it's super important to have somebody local or close by that can actually help with that. It does help managing things from a distance, especially if, for example, you are in Europe and there's a time change element as well. The other thing to consider is that you do have to get organized in a shorter off-season window. So if you get home, let's say May 1st, and you're going back to wherever you play at some time in August or early September, it's a 3 to 4 month window to get everything organized and prepped. You're still going to have to find furniture during the season. So if you play in North America, you play in the AHL or NHL, and you need to live in Toronto in the off season, chances are wherever you're living in season, you might need furniture for there too. And it might be a lot to like take stuff out of the property you have here in Toronto and put it to another one, because then it's harder to rent medium term if it's not furnished. And then timing the rental side, so the schedules line up for the off season. That's something else you're going to want to consider so that you do have a place to move into. And of course, that turns into more turnover year after year. So each year you'll have probably a new tenant coming in for those 6 to 8 months. Concept number 2, purchasing where you are playing. And this is a bit of a different concept where you're going to purchase a property to live in during the season. Now, there are some benefits to this too, is that first one is the team coordinator, could be a manager, whoever deals with letting the players know that they made the team and they're going to move in, will probably connect players to your property wherever you're living. This is also comes in great if you do change teams or are traded, just to give players an option to live. There is a possible cheaper in-season cost if you are living there and you're just bringing in roommates from the team. And obviously, if they're your teammates, they could be your roommates typically. You are going to want to rent it most likely short term in the off season when you move home, if you are not living there full time. So that's something to consider. It is a shorter term rent. So maybe one of the short term rental websites could work for that if it's allowed in the city that you own in. You don't need to find a new place to live every season with the team. So if you do get a couple year contract or maybe a 2-3 year contract, instead of finding a new property to rent every single year, you have something where you can own and live in year after year. And of course, if you have teammates living there with you, then they can help pay down the mortgage as well. Now, there are some things to consider. And the first one is that it is contract dependence. If you are on 1 year contract, might not be the easiest thing just to go and buy something every time you go to a new team every single year. The other thing to consider as well is renting to a teammate, charging them rent, potentially raising the rent each year. If your costs do go up, it might not be as easy to turn to a teammate and say, hey, whatever taxes went up or bills went up, can you pay a little bit more the next year? Might not be the easiest of conversations. Whereas sometimes if it's somebody you don't really have that teammate attachment to, might be a little bit easier of a conversation. You could also be buying out of your province or state. So there could be implications on taxes, income, things like that. And buying in off season, organizing for during the season, this could be a challenge too. So if you're Toronto in the off season, but maybe you play in, I don't know, Ottawa or something like that, and you have to go to Ottawa during the off season, find a place, purchase it, organize it, and then try to move in during training camp and stuff like that. There could be something to consider in that element as well. One of the challenges is you still have to find somewhere to live during the summer, and short-term furnished properties right now are getting harder and harder to find, and they are getting extremely expensive. That's something to consider as well if you're doing the own during the season and then rent during the summer type of setup. The other thing to consider is you might not know the area or city that you are going to play in or buy in. That's something you're going to want to do your due diligence and definitely reach out to a local expert who knows that area, city. So that way you know parts of the area that you probably want to live in and the best spots to live in the city, which will also give you good rentability if you're not there and things like that. The other last thing to consider is if that is not where you eventually want to live after hockey, is it something you're going to want to keep for a longer period of time? And that's just another thing to consider as well, because you might be looking for a place 10, 15 years down the road after your playing career. Might be something to factor in. Concept number 3, and this is purchasing in a city where you don't live in. You don't live there in the off season. You don't live there while playing. Typically, you're probably purchasing in a market that might be a little bit more affordable, or on the flip side, it just might be a place where you want something like a vacation home. Like what maybe you want something like, you know, a property down in Florida that you could just go vacation at. You can short-term rent it during the year, during the off season, but you don't want to live there full time. You just want it as a vacation spot. Definitely an option. So could be more affordable, but also could be more of a vacation property. You also might not need to furnish it. You might just be able to rent it vacant and you're off to the races. And it still gives you the upside in equity over time. So that is a good option for that. Other things to consider is in that circumstance, you'll probably want a property manager, as you will be managing from a distance full time. And you're going to want to check in on that property every single year as best you can, because that way you know that it's still in a great condition for either the next tenant or that it's getting good upkeep over time. Now, again, another thing to consider, you might not know the city or the area, and location is still incredibly important. It's really important to find a local expert in those areas to make sure that you know exactly where you're buying and the upside potential of the area. Here's the 4th concept. This is a bonus. I thought it would be important to just touch on, and this is purchasing pre-construction. And pre-construction is a property that won't be built for, let's say, 3 to 5 years down the line. The nice thing about it is it does have an extended deposit structure. So you might only put down 5% each year until closing, which could be 3 to 5 years down the road. You get to choose your finishes and the style of property typically. And usually the builders are giving incentives for these types of properties in order to sell them out. So there could be good potential there of builder incentives. The other things to consider is that you really want to purchase with a reputable builder, someone with a proven track record that consistently puts out great buildings and consistently delivers on time. It's super important. Now, there also could be possible delays, as with any construction project, and you're going to want to look out for development charges. I do recommend in all these aspects, you're going to want to work with someone who's familiar with pre-construction so that they can get the ins and outs of what you need to know when it comes time to negotiating the contract. Central locations are much more expensive than resale condos these days. So there used to be a time in pre-construction where you were purchasing, let's say today, for a cheaper price than what it would be worth in 5 years from now. Then you started purchasing for today's pricing for tomorrow. So it kind of like bridged the gap. Now, today, you're actually purchasing for future pricing. So I know in Toronto, the last few projects that I've seen have been anywhere between $1,500 and $2,000 a square foot. Whereas resale right now in the downtown core, you're looking probably somewhere between $1,000 and $1,200 a square foot. So if that's any indication where prices are going, there is an upside in what you're buying into in the future. There are a lot of locations in the different cities and different areas. I'm hearing about better incentives in different areas, but typically, especially in the Greater Toronto area, cheaper locations are usually less central. So if you're in the outskirts of the city of Toronto, typically the pricing per square foot is cheaper than what they are downtown. And those Toronto prices that I referenced there are for like prime downtown core buildings that are going up in the next 4 to 6 years, basically. So let's talk about the process. Today, we're not going to go through any numbers. If you do want to see some numbers of like what a cost to purchase would be, I have several YouTube videos and you can go check out the one that just talks about the cost to purchase. So we're not really going to go through that, but I will talk about 3 things, and that's building your team and the timeline to make a purchase, because I think those are super important to consider and just to kind of get the thought process going from an educational standpoint. So 3 things: build your team, timeline, and an example of timeline. So building your team, there are basically 5 people that are super important in the transaction. And a realtor, of course, you're going to need somebody who can find you the properties. You're also going to want someone who's pretty tech savvy in the sense of, if you are not in the city that you want to purchase in, actually take you through these properties and show you good video quality and things like that. So super important for that. You're also going to want someone who knows the local market, of course, and that they also know the ins and outs of both the buy side and the landlord side, because there is an element of getting the property ready for lease. And you're really going to want to make sure that they do the little things like professional photos and really make the place look amazing so that you can get top dollar for the rental as well. You're also going to want a mortgage agent or broker. Financing to be able to purchase these properties is something that you do need to talk with a mortgage broker or mortgage agent, mortgage specialist, on the different options you have for financing. And that can make a difference of whatever the interest rate or different things of product, which is super important. And also someone who deals with, I would say, athletes or people who move around often, because typically as a professional hockey player, that might be something where you move around more often than not. So they're going to want to be able to navigate that with you. You're going to want a good accountant, somebody who you could talk numbers with and make sure that, you know, everything's in line for your purchase as well. They're also going to help you once you have some rental income on these properties. It does go through an account as well. So you're going to want a good accountant. You're going to want a good real estate lawyer, someone who knows how to review status certificates if that's the case, someone who can help the deal close on time. So if you are shopping for a property, getting a status certificate review, especially in a competitive market, if you're buying a condo, super important. And also someone get the deal closed on time and give you great advice, of course. And 5th one, I put in a financial advisor because I think that is an element now for players and definitely something to consider as well when it comes to any kind of investing as well. So that's your team. And keep in mind, this team works for you. Like it's no different than on the hockey side. You have your player agent, then you have your strength coach, and you might have a physiotherapist, and you have someone who's going to do chiropractor, massage therapist, your whole team, your people that you trust that work to help your body be in its best condition and to help get you the best jobs available, and your coaches or whatever help you get through your next steps in your career. It's no different in real estate. You're going to want a full team that you trust that's going to make the process as easy as possible for you. I would say there's always going to be bumps in the road and challenges, but you're going to want a team that's going to help you navigate all of those. So let's talk timeline. And this is always, I find this is the question I get asked the most, is when do I start and where do I start? And talk about the timeline, then I'll give you an example of a timeline as well. And that's kind of where I think we can wrap things up. Always think of it backwards. And the reason I say backwards is usually if someone says, hey, Mike, I'm thinking of buying in whatever month, August, typically that means that they want the keys in August, not necessarily they want to buy in August. And average day closings is 30 to 60 days. So if they buy in August, then they're closing in October versus buying in June and closing in August, as an example, of course. So I would say it's typically a 3 to 6 month process from idea to your keys in hand. And we'll break this down. So you want to work backwards from keys in hands. Here are the steps of making a purchase, and this is not just for hockey players, this is basically across the board, anything real estate, especially in Ontario, and you get your pre-approval. So you find out how much you can qualify for, how much you can purchase for. And once you get that number, that'll typically dictate where to start with the property search. So for example, if your budget is 600,000, that'll typically navigate you towards a 1-bedroom condo versus a 3-bedroom detached house in the city, because that price point's much different. So typically your pre-approval will help navigate your search. Once you get that detail, then you connect with your realtor. We start the property search, we start showings, and then if you find something you like, it's time to make an offer. And the offer process could take one try, it could take several tries. It really depends on how the market is performing. It's not always that your first offer is accepted right away. And then if you do have conditions in your offer, then we're going to have a couple days to get those also taken care of. So you have your accepted offer, then you have your conditions in the offer, couple days to take care of those. Then you're looking at a 30 to 60 day closing typically. If you are a hockey player and you're on a bit of a time crunch, you'll probably want a earlier closing. But if you're purchasing for in the season, for example, and you buy something at the end of the season before, knowing you're going back to the next season, maybe you get a 90-day closing or a 120-day closing, which will line up to when you go back to the city after your off season. Just something to consider there as well. Once you get the closing date, prepare for things to help make your life easier once you get your keys in hand. And the reason I say that is start thinking of maybe ordering furniture, start thinking of ordering internet, changing over the utilities, all that stuff where you can do in that time period versus when you get the keys in hand, trying to quickly turn everything around sometimes gets a bit overwhelming. So you're going to want to think to prepare in the first place. And then once you get your keys in hand, it's time to set up the property. And I find typically most people want to get it set up as soon as possible so they can start living there. So if you're purchasing for your off season and you're going to move in on May 1st, let's say, for example, get your keys, most people want to be able to live there for the better part of May, June, July, let's say, for example, versus getting it set up for 3 months and then moving in the last week of July, or actually getting to enjoy it for a week before heading off into your season or whatever it may be. So you're going to want to make that plan to set up the property. And I broke it down here in a little example. And I just did one example, but I think the picture can be painted for all the different concepts. And essentially, if you're looking for a May 1st keys in hand, you're probably going to want to start this process in January, February. So that's when you're going to want to connect with the realtor and a mortgage broker to start creating a plan and getting your pre-approval ready. So when you create the plan, you're going to say, okay, this is the area I'm thinking, this is the type of property I'm looking at, and we're going to get the pre-approval, or you're going to get the pre-approval done. As you continue through February, March, and April, continue to narrow down the area, the property type, and the property search. That's when you start going in and out of properties and seeing what you like and don't like. Once you get your offer accepted in Ontario, your deposit is typically due within 24 hours or with the offer. And then you have anywhere, depending on what is in the terms of the agreement, but you're going to want to satisfy any conditions in the offer, prepare for closing, and then your closing costs you're going to have prepared for right before May 1st, usually a week before you're going to meet with the lawyer. And if I'm going too quick, definitely let me know. We can break this down some more, but that's your typical process. And then your keys in hand on May the 1st, and you start setting up this property right away. January, February, connect with your realtor, mortgage broker, create your plan, get your pre-approval done. February, March, and April, that's your time to start shopping, hopefully get your offer accepted, have your deposit ready and satisfy conditions, prep for closing. And then May 1st, keys in hand. And I always use the term time is money because you're going to want to get this place set up as soon as possible and ready for the next steps. If that's living in the summer, and then prep it for when you move away during season, that's when put it up for rent and get it rented out before you go. Or if you're prepping for moving in for the season, you're going to want to have those keys in hand and the place ready as soon as possible so other players can come live in your place or whatever you have your setup ready for during the seasons. Yeah, if anybody has any other questions, you can connect with me on everything, but Instagram is usually snippets of what's going on like today, but YouTube is pretty more in depth, definitely, when it comes to real estate in the Toronto area. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll chat soon.